Well, thank you everybody for joining us. We're very blessed to have people from all over the world join us at the moment. So thank you to those people who are staying up late, those people who have gotten up super early. Thank you to our panelists. And also, while we're at it, I'm going to thank Hayley and Adam, who are the backbone of this webinar and have helped us put everything together. So without further ado, I would formally like to welcome our panel. So Elise Sharpley, I'm just going to read a very brief bio. Their bios are available. Our very esteemed panel have bios available on LinkedIn and on their individual websites. Elise is an experienced human capital practitioner with deep technical expertise in organisational transformation, analytics and talent management practices. She has worked across a variety of industries, and helping clients to transform their workforce, including the design and implementation of holistic people strategies. Elise, thank you very much for joining us. And just before I introduce Rich, can you define holistic people strategies for our listeners, please?
Yeah, so this is all about considering all aspects of the human experience. So not just changing your workforce, but what are the business interventions you need to put in place for it to thrive. So taking a lens of not just changing people, but changing the systems that support people to have an ongoing impact.
Fantastic. And I will remind our listeners that if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We will either address them as we go through, or we'll come to the questions at the end. Rich Hirst, trained in high-performance psychology, has worked with thousands of leaders from around the world to promote leadership and cultural transformation. He has a master's degree of organisational psychology with postgrad studies in positive psychology. Rich, I'm going to be very careful how I speak to you in the future because of all the psychoanalysis, but how does org psych and evidence-based behavioural science research play out in the workplace?
Yeah, it's really interesting. That's a whole hour in itself. So, but I'll try and answer it in a minute. My experience, I was in a very similar role to Elise, actually, in consulting for many years, and realised progressively that we can sort of tweak all these dynamics in terms of tools and structures and systemic things. But if we don't also work on what's going on between people's ears, then we're missing a big opportunity and we'll potentially not achieve what we could. And so I have found that certainly psychology is increasingly playing a critical role in organisations of any description. And so understanding humanity at its best, which is what positive psychology focuses on, is incredibly relevant and incredibly practical. So lots of things that the science is now validating can be immediately put into place in an organisational context. So super relevant.
Fantastic. And it's the whole thing, isn't it, with science, that we make an observation, we create the hypothesis, we then go out and prove it and come back with the evidence-based to back up what the theory was. So we're going to go through today and talk about the future of work, but we're talking about the future of work through expansive leadership. And the future of work isn't just about whether we're going to be in hybrid workplaces, et cetera. It's going to be about predicting the skills that we're going to need for the future. It's about attracting and retaining talent. We know that topic has been very much discussed in many different forums at the moment. How are we going to reskill our workforces? How are we going to manage distributed asynchronous workforces? So let's get straight into the topics for discussion. The first question is, how might we predict the skills required for an abundant future with AI, robotics taking over the repetitive and mundane jobs as we've seen increasingly over, longer than the last decade. Robots are now making pizzas, they're making hamburgers, they're doing the deep frying in some restaurants. Car manufacturing, it's been happening there for a long time. I was at Walmart just before travel all closed down. The automation process in even loading groceries up to take to supermarkets, etc., highly automated. Can I get your opinions on what skills are we thinking that people are going to need in the future? And Elise, I know that you've done lots of research across this field. Rich, your background in psychology is huge in this field. Elise, I might throw to you first for a response to the question.
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of research around sort of, I guess, two buckets of skill sets. The first is obviously the technical one. So as adoption of technology, robotics and automation become more prevalent, we need people who can build those things and manage those things. So certainly there's the rise of the STEAM skill set with specific technical focus on things like data analytics and technology design. But along with that, our Access Economics team actually did a big piece of research on the rise of what was previously and sometimes, derogatorily called soft skills, but the rise of the innately human skills. So we talk about the 3Ds in automation. So, getting rid of the dull, dirty and dangerous work. And what we start to see that's left is all of the creative problem solving, the empathy, customer service, all of these aspects that are innately human, hence maybe why they were originally called soft. But I think that's no longer a derogatory term, or people are just referring to EQ at the risk of not offering something else, but we are seeing a huge rise in those soft skills. And I think it's true when our economists write a report, it's got a big picture of a love heart on the front of it. So if our economics team is starting to explore this topic, I feel like everyone is getting across the rise of some of these innately human aspects of how to contribute to a productive workforce.
Rich, what about you? What are your thoughts? I know we had a great conversation about Remind. Can you expand on that and give our listeners an idea of what your thoughts and what the practices are behind Remind?
Yeah, absolutely. And Elise, I love your thoughts. Yes, amazing to think that we're talking about things like love at work. Those soft skills are more relevant than ever before. And I think that speaks to the fact that, in terms of prediction, we're not very good at predicting. The world's changing so quickly. How can we possibly predict what's coming? And research again from University of Bath, a great book if you want to read called Uncharted, looked at the world's best forecasters and realized that they can predict accurately about 400 days out. That's it. The average person can only predict about 100 days out with any real accuracy. So it turns out humans are pretty bad at predicting, despite all the data that we've got. But again, the reason why that's the case is because often the data that we have is about the past, not about the future. And as we all know, the future is volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. So that's a really interesting time of life. But I think you're so right, at least the soft skills in some ways are more easy to predict around what's relevant, because they're the things that have been with us throughout time and will be increasingly differentiated from all the robots and automation and all those sort of tech solutions that come through. So whatever makes us uniquely human will be the things that double down on in the future. And I'm pretty confident we can predict that. And that's where this concept of reminding comes into play. So so much of the conversations about how do we reskill Australia, the world, whatever the case may be. But I think we also need to remind ourselves first. So we need to think about our mind frames. And I say mind frames very carefully, not mindsets, because our minds aren't set. A lot of people talk about mindset and it might sound like just a play on words, but I think it's a really important differentiator to remind ourselves every time that when we think about how we think, that we remind ourselves that we're not fixed, we're not set, we can change and evolve. And that's, I feel, the more important thing to focus on in some ways than skills, because skills are a bit like putting a Band-Aid on a sort of a wound. We need to sort out the base issue first. And I think a lot of the world that we're moving into, the future of work, is around thinking about how do we think about work and thinking about what are the new ways to interpret and respond to the world around us. Because if we're always just focusing on skills, we might be missing a big opportunity to change the sort of the deeper constructs that are determining how we act, behave, believe, respond to the world around us. So that's just a little bit about reminding, thinking about mind frames. And we've identified a whole bunch of mind frames that are important for the future of work. And that's sort of our focus, and probably comes from my Psych background, but we feel like that's even more important in some ways than the skills that we need to build as well.
I totally agree, and it's that holistic And we often talk in terms of the convergence of everything. For me, this is the age of convergence, and we're not only converging mindsets, but we're converging. So we put a lot of people into a room, converge their knowledge, and we come up potentially with a solution to a big problem. We're converging technologies in order to come up with those solutions or to create those solutions that we've imagined. We're converging different fields. So we are converging skills with mindset, with the technology, etc., that's being used. And in this idea of continuous learning, so we're in a world now where we're learning constantly, and if we're not, we're being left behind. In that world of continuous learning, how do we encourage, or how do we make it easy for our employees, for people within our organizations, our leaders, our executives, in fact, to take advantage of this continuous learning, and knowing that it's changing regularly, and it's not something that you can go, right, I've learned this and that's done and I'm going to be okay for the next 5 years. But how does continuous learning play into upskilling, reminding, that whole mindset piece? I'll throw to either of you for a response first.
Elise, your thoughts?
Well, I think when it comes to, learning, every time we do work around this topic, often people will be talking about a learning strategy initially, but the conversation very much turns to a learning culture, an organisation where the leaders actively promote and demonstrate learning agility. That means they make time for learning, they role model their own learning, they talk to their own mistakes. In a similar vein to what Rich was sharing before, the work of Carolyn Dweck on growth mindset, and those individuals that actively share, hey, it's not yet. I'm not yet ready for this because I'm still trying to learn that. It's not I can't do this, or I'm not going to try that. It's creating the environment where people have that not yet mentality. What are the things I need to attain to be able to move to the next stage in my career, or to be able to do what I'm already doing in my job better? So I think creating a culture where learning is a priority, and it's viewed as a priority because that's what leaders actively demonstrate and what they make time for. It's not a compliance tick in the box module that you have to smash out late on a Friday or in your own time. I'm actively sharing the way we're constantly unlearning old activities and habits and relearning new things. And I think that's probably one of the keys. And then the other area to that is thinking about the different vehicles for accelerating learning and embedding it in everyday life. And we talk a lot to the sort of the 4 E's, the education, the exposure, the experience, and the environment. How do you have those formal education moments, but also day-to-day exposure through mentors, different activities that are at your fingertips, both paid and free learning, on-the-job learning. So how do you curate this experience that's all encompassing, but then also have those role model leaders who say, this is what we're focused on and this is how we win in the market? I think we talk a lot within our own firm about outlearning the competition as a better approach than trying to just come in with something new.
I love that. And both your organisations, so Deloitte, who are our founding partners, Tenfold, who are our partners as well, you are both very much at the forefront of making sure all your members, all your employees, the people that work with you and your clients are actually at the forefront of learning. You're bringing lots of educational opportunities. And I know, Elise, a lot of the work that we've done with Deloitte has been in that, SDG number 8 is education. And I know that you guys are huge on that. Rich, what would your response be? So, and I know that you're helping all the members of Tenfold in that continuous learning, throwing new opportunities at them. But how do we bring all that together to ensure continuous learning?
Awesome, great question, Elise. I love your comments. They're so aligned with our thinking as well. And so I guess just very briefly, so Tenfold, what do we do? We work with the country leadership teams of global organisations with operations across Australia and New Zealand. So the big sort of global brands with businesses here. And it's working at that executive team level. And it's really interesting because there's not a lot of development that happens for them. Often it's they get the learning as they rise through the ranks, and then they get to the executive level and it kind of stops. It's all on the job, obviously. They're learning heaps that way, but there's a lack of really valuable opportunity for the executive team to learn from outside of their business. And so that's kind of what we provide a service around. And with that, in mind, the key point, I guess, and one of the mind frames I talked about before in this reminding for the future is that we can't afford to just learn in a linear fashion. We actually need to learn in an exponential fashion. That old expression, change is the only constant, isn't true. Change is not constant, it's accelerating. We saw that in a negative fashion with COVID. The pandemic is a great example of exponential change. And we all understand more than ever what exponential change looks like. But it happens in a positive way as well. And there's some great examples of companies that are growing exponentially. But the world is exponential's here. It's change is accelerating. It's not constant. So if change and the world is moving in a fashion that's exponentially evolving, then leaders, people everywhere, need to learn in an exponential fashion as well. And so I guess that learning piece is absolutely at the heart of preparing for the future of work, because again, we're not very good at predicting, but we can prepare. And so how do we accelerate our ability to learn? And it really interesting sort of two concepts just briefly. One is this idea of just-in-time learning. So making sure you've got a really big peer network, a big peer group of people that you can connect with who you can learn from, because there's always going to be stuff that you just didn't see coming. And so how can you reach out quickly and learn from others and harness the insights of the collective, not just the people in your echo chamber. So that's a really important way to learn, just in time. And then just in case learning is the other opportunity. And that's where it's not necessarily efficient, because you might be learning things that you're not sure whether they'll play out or otherwise, but you certainly don't want to be trying to learn them once they happen. And so I guess there's a two sort of tier strategy for accelerated learning to build a really diverse, powerful network around you so you can learn just in time from that collective, and invest in learning about things that where there's a pretty good chance of them happening, and just in case they do play out. Because we're all limited by time, but if we can sort of double down on some of those things, again, at the time it may not feel efficient, but if those things do play out, then you built a knowledge base, and so you're not flying blind when those things do happen.
So I think maybe potentially we could say that one of the most important skills that we need to teach people is that to be open to continuous learning, to understand that we don't know what we don't know, and to put ourselves into situations that are, you hear it all the time, go outside your comfort zone, but attend different events, look at different fields, read beyond what your industry is, and see what's out there to be able to adapt and adopt, which kind of leads into the second.
Actually, Christine, can I just quickly jump in there? Because I think that idea of continuous learning is one of those mind frames that needs to shift. I think we do need to be talking about accelerated learning, because continuous sort of feels like this nice, smooth trajectory. It's more like a linear process. And I loved, Elise, what you said before about unlearning. This whole journey of learning isn't necessarily additive. It might be that we need to, there's a school of thought or approach that is actually irrelevant now. And so we need to unlearn those skills or ways of thinking and actually relearn or learn new things. And so it's not continuous in any way, shape or form. It's bumpy, but over time, it's definitely exponential. So accelerated learning, I feel, is the core, one of those core mind frames that we need to really embrace and each challenge ourselves. And it's also, at least said, how do we build a culture of accelerated learning? Because it's great for the individual to do it, but ultimately it's about the collective doing it together.
And I actually challenge unlearning, because I don't believe that we should unlearn anything. We should bring it with us on the journey. I don't think we've ever gone, that now is irrelevant. I think it's and now. So I've actually challenged, we've got a couple of colleagues at expert faculty who do talk about unlearning to relearn. And I desperately challenge that. But again, I think that's a conversation for another day, because we're not going to get to the 4 points on our conversational piece. With all that in mind, how do we use that information because there's people talking about the Great Resignation, and I have hesitation around calling it the Great Resignation, whether it's the Great Reassessment, whether it's the Great Tapping on the Shoulder. There is a shift. We're expecting it to come to Australia. We're not sure how that's going to play out yet. But how do we attract, retain talent in this? Just say that we're building this new accelerated workplace and what that might mean at the end of this conversation to each of us. But how should we be leading our organizations, Rich, in your terms, in an accelerated way to retain the talent so that we don't lose them, so that it's not the shoulder tap and it's not the, hey, I'm reassessing my whole life, because we'll talk about culture in a minute. But what are your thoughts around attracting and retaining talent? What's some of the research showing, Elise?
Yeah, look, and I can talk to a little bit of research, but I've also got to say, you've got to take all of that with a grain of salt right now, because everything's unfolding on a week by week basis. And even I think of research we were doing 7 months ago that has rapidly evolved in terms of employee sentiment, market conditions. So I'm going to talk with confidence, but without the credibility of peer-reviewed research that's got some kind of longitudinal nature to it, because it's all kind of unfolding right now. I think a couple of themes, though, that I can talk to where the signals around the proof points seem quite strong. The first thing is, I would say that flexibility at this point in time is table stakes for retention. So throughout COVID and coming out of COVID, the rise of autonomy and the ability to choose when you work and where you work, we've had to do it, and people have learned a new habit, they've galvanized that new habit, and they have a new set of expectations on what will be on offer. And I think if, as an organisation, you haven't taken a clear view around how you're increasing personal agency of your employees on when and where they work, I think you'll miss a trick. So we're seeing a lot of sentiment of different organisations who've taken different positions on the topic of flexibility. But I would say that having a flexible work policy at this point in time is probably table stakes, because we've all been experiencing it for such a long period. We know the advantages and the disadvantages, and chances are your competitors have already offered something if you haven't, because most organisations have. So I would say that's the first thing, which is probably more of a hygiene factor at this point in time. The second area, I think, we did quite a bit of research a few years ago, and the Burson by Deloitte model of a simply irresistible organisation came about. And it basically looked at all of the research around what creates a really, and I guess the person was a massive Robert Palmer fan, but what creates a really irresistible organisation, one you want to stay with, and one that creates those sticky relationships. And I think there are a couple of factors in that framework that have been hugely accelerated and amplified during this period. And I've got some proof points for it, but I've also probably got my own assertions around it from things I'm seeing and hearing. And I guess the big one is meaning at work. And I think there's a raft of research around this topic that we want to be a part of something greater than ourselves. It's no longer that inspiring to get out and see the growth of EBITDA or a commercial return. We actually want to be contributing to a better and bigger world with social justice and fairness, humanity, and a strong and sustainable environment. And I think that theme around meaning at work is continuing to rise rapidly. So the conscious consumer, stakeholder capitalism, the rise of employee activists, people walking off site in revolt to decisions that people have made. I think we're going to see more of this, because the devolution of decision authorities that came through from this big experiment, the way people are able to walk with their feet in the talent economy right now, I think if you're not able to cater to those different stakeholder groups and to provide a sense of meaning at work, I think that's going to be a really big point of competition. With, social enterprises are outperforming from a profitability perspective, but also from a growth perspective. And employees right now, I think, when you're facing into health concerns as well, when you're spending a lot of time alone thinking, people are starting to reprioritise what's important in their lives. And that's probably less of a science-based and more of a reading the tea leaves of sentiment. But I do think it's going to become ever more pressing for people to choose out jobs that feel meaningful and that contribute to something greater than themselves. That's my take at least. But I would love to hear if either of you have alternative views or more science to back that assumption.
Definitely not. We would totally agree with you. I can see Rich nodding. I know we shared an experience this week, Rich. And let's go to that point. Rich, your response to giving people something, because I know there's total alignment here as well.
Yeah, I think we must be reading the same tea leaves, Elise. It's and there's something in that as well. I mentioned before we're not very good at predicting, but picking up on the weak signals is a really core skill for the future. I said that it's focused more on mind frames than skills, but that is a great skill to have. And I think all the things you're talking about are weak signals that are becoming stronger and stronger, and because there's this sort of theory with exponential that it happens gradually and then suddenly, that's the whole idea of exponential change. To start with, it's not really a lot going on, and then suddenly it just takes off like a pandemic. So reading the weak signals is really critical. But jumping back to the question, the idea around the Great Resignation, I know we've got a global audience here. The conversations I'm having with people, there's certainly a lot of it happening in the sort of the sort of top talent end of the market. But I don't know if when you look across the entirety of the Australian population, whether it's as big an issue as it would be for those on the call in the US. And so I think the term, I don't know who coined it, great marketing effort there. But my sense would be it probably came from the States, because I do feel that it's a bigger issue there than it is here. And we had lunch, we had a conversation last week with our federal bank, and they also felt that there's not the data in Australia, and this is in the press, but it was picked up in our conversation as well. The data in Australia suggests that it's less of an issue here. It's more with just playing catch up. There hasn't been a lot of movement during lockdown for obvious reasons. And so we're just playing a bit of catch up now. But when you talk to individual companies, certainly there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that there's a huge amount of change as well. And so for those companies that are experiencing that, which isn't reflective necessarily of the whole population, but for those companies, I agree, it's agency. How do we give people back a sense of control and contribution? And one of the great models we came across the other last year, well, actually earlier this year, an amazing organisation based out of New York called Vega Factor. They talk about the 3 Ps. And so when it comes to motivation, and so you could argue that people leave when they're not feeling motivated anymore, there are 3 Ps to be mindful of. And Elise, you mentioned one of them, which is purpose. Purpose is obviously critical, meaning how do we make sure that our workplace is a space that's doing something that's doing good as well as doing well as an organisation. But that's only one of 3 Ps. The more important P that Vega Factor have found is actually play. So play doesn't sound like a word that's often used in a work context, but what they're talking about there is this opportunity to try new things, to experiment, to take small risks, have a go, and that's the agency piece, giving people the autonomy to have a crack and see what they can do. So have a crack may not translate in other cultures, it's an Australian term, but that you have a go and see how you see what you can achieve without taking huge amounts of risk. But that's how you learn as well. That's how you accelerate learning, is by play. And so companies, Vega Factor's research found that play is actually twice as important as purpose when it comes to people's motivation at work. And then the 3rd P is potential. So that may not surprise you, but you can have an amazing why, an incredible purpose, and people can experiment a lot. But if people don't feel like they're able to achieve and move towards their full potential in the workplace, that's another reason why they might go. And so as a filter to sort of think about, how much autonomy and opportunity we're giving our people to play at work and to experiment and try new things, to test out new skills, to learn. And how clear is our purpose, and how linked is that to their individual purpose? And then finally, to what degree are we helping them to move in the direction of their potential? If we just have those, and not just the big conversations, but if we have conversations around those 3 things, I think we've got a much better chance of not losing people And the data certainly backs that up from some pretty smart people, way smarter than me.
I reckon this play thing is, I think this is a really critical aspect as well, just from a more just reactive point in time from a cultural perspective. There's similar research in the simply irresistible model around this concept of time for slack. So this ability to have oxygen, to innovate, to create, to learn, to do other stuff. But I do think, we talk about earn the commute with people trying to entice people back into the office,
yes.
and, have that connection. But that sense of fun in the workplace after, 2 years of, fun and frivolity was not high on the radar for a while. I do think that organisations are starting to curate more fun in the office, or think about, I like to think about the separation of the spheres in the Industrial Revolution, where people went from home is a place of love and production to actually, in the Industrial Revolution, somebody has to go out and earn the wages, and somebody has to stay at home and take care of the home and the children. And we started to see home as this locus of love, and the workplace is this place where you go and you clock in and you work and you clock off and you come home. And I think COVID has really pushed the spheres back together. Yeah. And then all of a sudden we've got home, work, love, all happening in this one particular domain. And I think we're at this crossroads now where people are trying to make sense of what that future would look like. And I hear a lot of rhetoric of, I'm going into the office to have fun and I'm staying home to do asynchronous work, to get stuff done. So I'll stay here, I'll concentrate, but if I want fun and connection, celebration, coaching, I'm going to head into the office for all of those social activities, this real switching of those spheres. And I think this is where there's some interesting trends starting to play out, because some people are saying, we're going to stay flexible, everyone's going to work at home, or we're going to do some flavour of hybrid. But we're seeing signals on both sides of people who are working from home saying, I am not online after 6. I'm drawing a line. I'm drawing a line between work and home in my home, and that's my line. And I think different organisations right now need to figure out both parameters to provide healthy hybrid working, but also how do you inject fun and frivolity and all of the good things from social connections either into the hybrid experience at home, or in a much more intentional way in the workplace, where we can't just rely on serendipitous bumps in the corridor, because if you've got nothing for people to come in for, you're not going to have a vibrant workplace where those serendipitous things can kind of look after themselves, if they will. So I'm kind of interested in seeing some of the different ways organisations are starting to take action on those areas, and some are getting pretty serious about fun in the workplace while they try and earn this commute back.
We've actually had our people online on a Friday afternoon. We've been playing games for half an hour on a Friday afternoon, lightening everything up, having some fun, and testing each other's skills on drawing and guessing and all kinds of things. But that laughter, we know that laughter. So again, what I'm hearing from both of you is a convergence of everything that we know forming itself, but forming it to our unique capacities as well. We each have unique individual skills that we bring. And it's interesting, the whole motivation aspect of it, years of research done around motivation. We still want recognition from our peers and our immediate managers. We don't really, we don't really mind whether it's coming from the top. It's the people around us that we want to feel validated by. I just want to go to a couple of questions. We've had some really great questions come in from the audience before we move into the next section. So one of our attendees says, typical companies promote within taking those who have achieved in their department and promote to manager, yet they typically are not experienced as managers, and then the person usually goes from a top player and not to a top manager. Recommendations for either hiring non-business related staff into manager positions or developing the non-manager to a manager. Really good question, because you see it play out. Some people actually don't want to be managers. Some people want to be managers, don't actually understand what management issues are. What would, Elise, what's your response to that question? Then I'll go to you, Rich, because I know that you've spoken to quite a few CEOs around that issue as well. The question is in the Q&A if you want to have a look at it.
So I think I understand the question, and I have my own personal view on this, and there's some pretty divergent views on this. I think there was a real flurry of rhetoric in sort of the 90s and 2000s on great managers and the difference between managers and leaders and being charismatic and inspirational. And I actually think there's a rising sentiment of having leaders who have technical aptitude and the leadership stuff. So I err on the side of you can promote great technical people when you can develop those leadership capabilities within them. I know people often talk about the classic, it's a salesperson who hits their sales metrics, and so then we promote them into a leadership role, but they can't lead people. I think there's obviously some permission to lead that comes with being a great leader. So what are the actual capabilities of great leadership, and does that person have those capabilities? So there's a raft of leadership research on what those capabilities are. I really like this sort of Adam Grant view of leadership, which is that power doesn't corrupt, power amplifies what you've already got. So if you have someone who's great within your organisation and needs refinement, stepping into a leadership role and growing those leadership capabilities, you're going to get more of what you already had. If you have someone that doesn't operate with the right behaviours, that has behaviours that aren't conducive or additive to your culture, that don't support diversity and inclusion, you can expect to get more of that if you promote those individuals into leadership roles. The thing I find tricky about this question is that I don't think we should be disregarding technical capability. And I think sometimes it's really easy to get this sense of we're hiring in a leader or we're hiring in a manager and they're visionary and charismatic and supportive and they're the connector. But actually, I think you need to have a level of technical aptitude that is inspiring and also promotes that idea of unique combinations of skill sets. It's no longer good enough just to have a middle management layer of people who are inspirational leaders. We actually need people who can lead in different areas that have those unique skills. And one of the examples, to go back to our very sort of initial conversation around data and analytics, you need to be charismatic and you need to know how to write code. And I think if you don't have that credibility, you can't stretch your team in a credible way because you can't even enter into the dialogue properly. So yeah, I guess I'm for having technical capability and leadership capability would be my preference. But I know there's a raft of very diverse opinions on this. So yeah, Rich, keen to hear your take on, is it the rise of leadership or can you have both?
And I'm also going to throw in an extra challenge for you, Rich, because I think this might come around your conversation around autonomy as well. So what are we looking for?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and the fact that we've been asking this question for quite a while suggests that we haven't quite cracked the answer. But I'll have a go at just sharing a few thoughts. One is, and this goes to Elise's comment right early on around holistically focusing on sort of performance and cultures. I think part of the issue is remuneration strategy. I think there's a natural pathway where to get paid more, you have to move into management. That's the sort of tradition. More and more companies, though, are realising that actually, no, there's a technical pathway that you can pursue and potentially get paid more than a manager. We've seen it mostly in sales, where people have been potentially, maybe even getting paid more than the CEO, not very often, but certainly paid more than maybe others in the executive team, because they're just brilliant individual contributors. But I do think REM is a part of the challenge here. If we don't think differently, remind ourselves about our remuneration strategy, think differently about that, then we're just going to keep getting people feeling like, well, if I want to get an extra 20K, I need to move into management. So that's a big issue, which some companies are addressing. And I think, don't overlook the power of systems to drive behaviour, as Elise sort of touched on earlier. So that's, I think, one part of the dynamic which can address this issue, because I do think it is an issue. I agree with Elise as well that it's good to have some technical knowledge, but some of the best CEOs I've ever worked with have very little technical knowledge. So I'm not sure if I can mention his name, but there's a very well-known CEO in Australia. He now runs a global tech business from across Australia and New Zealand. And when he moved from another massive global tech brand to run a business that was where he really didn't have any experience in the field that it was in. It was a new business, and he actually felt it was massively liberating because he didn't have the deep technical knowledge. His focus then became, how do I just set people up for success that have that technical capability? He needed to know enough. Sure, that's important. But where he really thrived was actually realizing my job as the leader isn't to know everything that you do. My job as a leader is to clear the pathway so you can do your job. And that is a different skill set. And so arguably, yes, we need to be developing managers from a different pathway. If they can come through that technical spectrum, great, but we need to do a better job of actually building that skill set. And then the third point I'd like to make is just that I feel like, in some ways, you're so right that technical managers often aren't fit for management, or not always, because of the development pathway and a whole lot of other issues. And maybe they shouldn't need to go into that to get more pay anyway, or it being seen as the next step from a hierarchical point of view. But I do think even existing managers, even the ones that have been good in the past, are going to be challenged to be good in the future, because of the previous set of questions and conversations that we had around the fact that leadership and management has changed now. The delineation between you as a manager helping people to get their tasks done, that doesn't cut it maybe it hasn't always cut it, but it's even going to cut it less in the future because of this blend of work and life, which, was an artificial distinction anyway. But increasingly, managers and leaders need to be able to help people to thrive in all of life, because there's very little differentiation between where work stops and life begins now. And working from home just has reinforced that, but just the whole expectation of employees now is that you can help me with my performance, sure, but also I expect you to be able to support me from a well-being point of view. And so going right back to the beginning conversation, those soft skills that Elise talked about, the human skills, that's why they're more important than others. And a lot of existing managers haven't built those skills out yet. And so, again, they're the ones that I do feel we need to develop for the future of work, because they're increasingly important. So not only are we going to expose some technical people that have moved into management roles, we're going to expose a lot of people that are already managers who might have been doing an okay job, but now they're being asked to do much more human stuff over and above the tasks and technical stuff, and focusing on performance. So I think, being a manager and leader right now is it's a wonderful opportunity to really think differently and embrace all of who people are, and that word holistic comes up again.
I think I love that the whole way that we've almost circled back to the human, and I'm not sure why we divided our personalities between home and work back to the convergence of home and work that you mentioned before, Elise, and all those skills. So it's almost like the holistic person that we need to be wherever we are, and be true to ourselves, have that autonomy, and have the confidence to be able to do that. I'm going to go, that's a really good segue into Ian's question. I'm very aware that we're in the last 15 minutes of the webinar, and we're only halfway through where we're going to be. So if I can ask you to consider shorter answers, even though the answers are really powerful in themselves. But Ian says, thank you very much for your wonderful insights. I often find, particularly in business, that we have a limited view of what a human is or needs to be in a business. Given that the most profound proportion of who we are is unconscious, how can we integrate growth in this area of understanding into the business world? So again, bringing all that conversation together is, we're almost there, Ian. But Elise, how would you respond to that question?
That's a big question. I think, sort of tying it back to the previous conversation, I think a lot of the exceptional leadership is now leveraging this idea that human beings are rich with latent potential. And those great leaders are the ones that treat human beings as though they're rich with latent potential, that they can fluidly develop their skills, that they have hidden talents, and they can tap into it and curate it and link it to other people so it turns into something greater than the sum of its parts. So I do think there's this view of having a belief in someone and then also giving them something to believe in, so that there's a sort of level of commitment from both sides there. I think one of the things I find difficult about this topic, and Christina, even the comment around work is about total human beings, I do think it is about being more of a total human being, But I think the commercial construct that goes with the psychological contract makes it tricky. And we see this in organisations that are small family organisations, where they leave and they say, they're in my family, they're in my life, we're living in each other's pockets. I didn't sign up for that. I want to do this particular form of work I love. I don't want to inherit a new family. One of the big US organisations has come out and said, we are not a family, but we're a group of collective individuals working towards a common good. So I do think the delineation of whole self, everyone's together, it's like a family construct, I think that's also being challenged. So I'm not sure that there's just this continuum to being a whole self, deeply personable, you know, having complete blurred lines between home and work. I do think we're still trying to figure out where do we want those lines. And well-being, yeah, we want you invested in that, but, you know, working outside of work hours, spending time on the weekends, no thanks, don't want that. So I'm not sure that was an articulate response, but those are some of my thoughts on that question.
No, I love that. And what I'm hearing is it is individualistic. Like, there is no one size fits all. Rich, what's your response?
Yeah, just picking up on Elise's point, I do. We've heard that from a few different sources, and it's all stuff you might know or come across as well. But, you know, Amy Edmondson's work about psychological safety, you know, that's sort of become very popular. But she's the first person to say it's not enough. As a leader, you also need to promote high performance standards. Like, you know, so it's a combination of psychological safety combined with very clear standards of what great looks like. And so in a work context, you need to be able to do both. You know, Kim Stott we spoke to last year as well, and her whole work around radical candor talks about, you know, high performance exists when you combine care and challenge. So you're so right, Elise. In a work context, family's the last thing that we don't want a family culture. And we spoke to Patty McCord, who built Netflix with Reed Hastings in December last year, and she was talking about, you know, at Netflix, they talked about themselves as a sporting team, never a family. And in a sporting team, you know, there's care for sure, there's focus, there's supporting the person, but there's very clear performance standards. And so it's a combination of both that creates a great company. And so I totally agree with you there, Elise. But in terms of this, the unconscious piece, great question, Ian. I love this idea I heard from my mentor the other day, which is that, you know, about a third of our expectations are espoused, about a third we're clear on, but we don't necessarily share with the other person or our teams, and then about a third of them aren't even clear in our heads, and so how can we possibly espouse them? So in that case, you know, there's a lot of unconscious content in a workplace, and I think, again, a skill or even a mind frame, the mind frame, I guess, is to think that, well, there's a lot of stuff that's unspoken. How do I start to get that out in the open? And then the skill is great questioning. So how do I become a great question? You know, how do I build my curiosity and ask great questions? Because the prize in the future goes to the people with the best questions, not the best answers, because the answers are evolving so quickly. So how do you build curiosity and build that skill of questioning to uncover the unconscious thoughts and perceptions and expectations that people around us have? That's a massive skill set for the future.
So I'm going to move us to the next question. And what I want to leave the audience with is the fact that we do need to ask more questions in that section. We need to ask more questions. We need to have more conversations. And I do totally believe that individual businesses will create their own unique expectations and their own unique pathways. Which brings us to, I think we've kind of answered number 3. So if I can just get a bit of a summation from you both, how will we skill and reskill our workforce? So if we take into consideration, you know, the humanizing, the differentiations between organizations, the soft skills, the hard skills, disrespectful as we believe those terms have been, how do we pull all that together to give our listeners an idea of potentially how we might skill, reskill, upskill, whichever skill or whichever curiosity questions, or if we're just going to go into accelerated learning, what's some summation of the conversation so far you can both give our listeners in response to that question? And Elise, I know we're always going to you first. So Rich, I'm actually going to throw to you first as I can see you writing your responses. So over to you, Rich.
I'd love to, I wish there was a succinct answer to it. If I can provide a quick framework that I find really helpful in building culture, there's sort of 4 key ways to build culture, because this is a cultural solution as much as an individual strategy. 4 ways to build culture. Firstly, to role model. So as leaders in the business, if you're a leader, how can you be role modeling that accelerated learning approach or mind frame? What are you doing to develop yourself and continually stretching and asking great questions, doing all the things that we've been talking about. So start with you. And that goes to the unconscious piece that Ian talked about before. What are you doing to raise your self-awareness first and foremost? How are you collecting feedback around what you're doing, how you're impacting others? The role model is number 1. What do you encourage, and what stories do you tell in your business is number 2. So what sort of, if you're role modeling, that's great, but then what are you recognizing and rewarding in your business right now? That can be through remuneration, we've touched on before, but it can be through praise, it can be through awards, it can be through a whole lot of different things. But what are the stories you're telling? They're often the best ones. Who are the heroes in your business? Are they the people that are reskilling, reminding for the future? What do you discourage is the third thought in terms of building a culture. So what behaviours, mind frames do you actually are holding people back from being prepared for the future? And be very overt about that. And then the last point, which is the one that's often missed, is what do you tolerate? Your culture is often a reflection of what you tolerate. And so there's possibly some behaviours and mind frames that exist in your work environment or organisation, whatever that looks like, that which is stopping people from embracing the opportunity that the future presents. And so thinking about role modelling, encouraging storytelling, what you discourage and what you tolerate can start to build a culture that is more future ready. And then it's a matter of sort of being very overt and intentional about making those things happen and taking the people on the journey and telling them why you're doing things a bit differently, which is very exciting and plays into the play, purpose, potential sort of concept that we talked about before as well.
Okay, I'm hearing great convergence of a whole lot of converging ideas here. I'm very passionate at the moment about converging all the things that we know. Elise?
I think from the conceptual to practical, I'd say from a conceptual perspective, that construct around the 4 E's of education, environment, experience and exposure is so solid when it comes to creating all the conditions for learning. And I think you can look at that, in your current role to be better at it in the next role, but in your future career. But the second thing I'd tie in there is for those areas, once you've figured out what those critical skills are and the reskilling priorities of your organisation and how you win and what your people want, I think it's about looking at 2 practical things that you can do to really accelerate. One is, what are those behavioural nudges that you can embed that create new habits for those 4 areas? And one great retailer in the UK created one of those nudges, which was, okay, make it fun and engaging, and they did a capability Tinder match. So upcoming projects from it, we talk about the E of exposure, upcoming projects, my skill set, swipe left if you've got a match, So it starts to curate you towards those experiences and the exposure areas that you want to get while matching up your skill set. So thinking about practical behavioural nudges to create new habits around learning. And then the second thing I would say is have some big symbolic stuff as well. So some organisations right now are partnering with academic institutions. They're launching new internal academies. They've got leaders who are standing up and saying, here are the 10 biggest mistakes I made in my career because I didn't learn these things. So they're creating these cultural moments that are hugely symbolic, which accelerate everyone's momentum towards those new behaviours. So I'd say create some new habits with some behavioural nudges, have some big symbolic moves, and hang it on some kind of clear articulation of where you're trying to get your workforce towards in the future as well.
And I've just read your comment about looking forward to the day words love, trust and wisdom are comfortably built into business, that it doesn't need to be family to include these qualities. My North Star is a world of unconditional love. So I'm totally with you on that. Let's go to question number 4, which is, how will we manage distributed, diverse, asynchronous workforces and maintain engagement within organisations and with our clients? It's an hour-long response. I'm going to ask you to to try and answer the question with a bit of guidance. Maybe we can guide our listeners to where they can go for further information, but how should we manage these distributed? So we've talked about what a manager is, we've talked about the different things that we're all going to have to manage as leaders, but within ourselves as well. Elise, I will go to you first again this time. So how are we going to manage all this distributed stuff?
Well, I think the first thing that is useful is to think about your principles as an organisation and what you stand for and what you're trying to achieve. And I think those principles can then start to feed into the actions that you're taking. And when it comes to managing asynchronous work, we've seen a lot of different flavours of this, right? Where, Dropbox is saying you must come into the office only for these activities or stay at home and do asynchronous work on your own. Other organisations are trying to mandate specific days in the week to come in to manage volatility in real estate usage. So there are lots of different ways people are approaching this particular topic. I think starting with your principles gives you some guardrails for extrapolating into specific actions. So, one of the principles we have within Deloitte is we start with trust. We would be terrible at hiring and growing people if we didn't trust them to do the right thing. So if we start with trust, that means we're going to trust people to make the best decision. Okay, how do we help people make the best decision? We're going to share with them some of the moments that matter in person and the moments that are probably better when you're on your own. So they can make their own decisions because we trust them to, but we're going to provide some support so they can make the best decisions. So we know things like coaching conversations and celebrations and team events are better in person. Yeah, you can do online Scrabble and gaming, but there's just something super deflating about having social connections on Zoom. So here are some tips on those moments to choose. So I think this tying together some clear principles about what your organisation stands for and the kind of culture and performance climate you want to create. And then I think putting those into action with clear support mechanisms so that you can see them into fruition. I know that sounds like a bit of a catch-all. There's not one specific recipe that matches every single business model. But I think if you start with those principles, and it takes a while to really crack those principles, you can then extrapolate them and play them out so people don't just agree with the sentiment, but the realities of the actions that have to sit behind that sentiment to help employees thrive as well.
I love that. Walk the talk and figure out what the foundations are. It's the foundations, isn't it, Rich?
Yeah, for me, it comes back to play and it's just experimenting. So I think, yes, we can learn a lot from the collective and see what other companies are doing, but the answer will be somewhat unique to your organizational context. And so play around with it, put in a quarterly experiment and let everyone know that we don't know the answer. The whole world is going through this at the same time. So this is new space. It's greenfield stuff. So let's experiment over the next quarter and learn from that. But be scientific about it. Sort of put in place experiments, test, sort of option one, option two, which one worked, which one didn't. You can set up teams, but see it as a wonderful opportunity to experiment and build a pathway that really works for you while you're learning from other organizations as well. And I think that's how we accelerate the learning. Instead of saying, okay, 3 and 2, and you have to be here for Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and blah, blah. It's like, no, do that, but just as a short-term experiment and see how it works, collect the data afterwards, and then, learn from it and put in place the next quarterly experiment. I feel like that's going to be more critical than ever, which is why play is so essential. And to Elise's point as well, play is about having fun. So have fun with it, and because, life's too short, hey? So let's make sure work is a great place to be. And I think, giving people a sense of trying new things and learning and trying to make it a great place to come to and be part of is the big opportunity going forward.
So at the risk of going a minute over our allotted time, I'm going to ask you both for a closing comment on how we might turn all of this, the acceleration of the acceleration that has been happening in our lives. How do we turn all of this into an opportunity for companies and for individuals moving into the future that we're going to create, our future by design? How are we going to use it as an opportunity? A bit of a summation, I guess, on how you're personally feeling right now. Elise?
I think take the topic seriously and invest in it as a part of your strategy. So if you don't have a workforce strategy as a part of your strategy, you will not thrive. So take the topic seriously. And I think this kind of zoom out, zoom in methodology around this is great. Looking at a very far ahead in time, where do we want to be? And so what are those specific actions right now we're going to experiment with to try and accelerate towards that future? And that must include things that you're going to stop. The things you're going to stop doing, not just additive stuff that we're going to try and do on the side of our desks.
Yep.
And such a great opportunity to involve more people in the business. So I'm a massive fan of David Cooperrider's work around appreciative inquiry, and he talks about whole system change. Gartner did some great research around change initiatives, and they talk about open source change. So don't feel like this has to be a decision that happens at the top of the business. Involve people. You can involve the whole system, even including your partners, providers, customers, suppliers, family even in this. It can be done. And so I think to see it as a huge opportunity, it certainly is. And I think the prize, again, I've talked about prizes before, but it goes to the companies that take everybody on the journey with them. And that's really exciting, because a lot of the things about strategy in the past have been the realm of the top team, and increasingly, and especially in this current context, the answer might lie elsewhere. So how do you tap into the wisdom of the crowd and embrace that? And this is probably the best opportunity we've had to do that for a long time.
So in wrapping up, I would love to say thank you so much for your expertise, your knowledge, sharing both what you know from your business experiences, but also from a personal perspective. So thank you, Elise. Thank you, Rich. Great partnerships that SU enjoys with Deloitte and with Tenfold. Thank you to all our audience. Your comments have been coming through thick and fast, and they're very much considered and very well appreciated. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We look forward to your company on future webinars, future podcasts. Please keep the conversations happening. The only way that we're going to continue to develop is to have those respectful, mindful, and, to your point, Elise, trustful. And Rich, I love the word autonomous that you kept using as well. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful Friday. Hopefully what we've done is stimulated further conversation. There is no one size fits all. We look forward to your company. Go out there and converse, converge, connect with everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks, Elise.